Principi, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Holmes Norton, and members of the subcommittee. I welcome your invitation to comment on your introduced legislation, H.R. 1734, the Civilian Property Realignment Act. I commend the President and you, Mr. Chairman, for the introduction of this much-needed legislation, and I certainly commend Ranking Member Norton for her enormous contribution to this effort over the years. When I appeared before the committee on April 6th, I recommended several changes to the administration's proposal to establish a Civilian Property Realignment Act. I am gratified to note that a number of those recommendations are included in the bill. For one, the legislation establishes a commission, vice a board, expands the number of members on the commission to 9 versus vice 7, and calls on the President to name individuals to the commission in consultation with the leadership of the House and Senate, and requires Senate confirmation. Further, the legislation holds the President and not the Director of the Office of Management Budget rightfully accountable for the review and submission of Commission recommendations. In my view, these steps will bring greater independence to the Commission and more transparency to the process. As I indicated at the April 6th hearing, independence and transparency are the sine qua non to the success of this process. This is especially critical in the independent analysis of all federal properties, whether they're on the list for closure or not. And I say this from my experiences as chairman of the 2005 BRAC Commission. We considered properties that the Secretary of Defense did not have on the list. And certainly as Secretary of Veterans Affairs, I was under enormous pressure not to close any facilities, whether they were antiquated or not, that I felt were diverting much-needed resources to 21st century health care for our nation's veterans. You have requested that I review your legislation and provide additional comments and recommendations. I have very few. Section 11 calls for the establishment of standards and criteria and outlines 9 principles upon which to develop criteria. It is not clear to me if there is a difference between standards and criteria, and in the absence of term definitions, I would recommend that the term standards be defined or deleted. I applaud the 9 principles and would suggest that they be established in law as the criteria against which federal agencies and the Commission must evaluate each facility for disposition. I cannot overemphasize the importance of criteria independently established and implemented. Section 12 outlines the duties of the Commission. While the legislative language infers that the Commission utilize criteria, it is not clear how the Commission would utilize that criteria. In the Base Realignment Closure Act, the BRAC Commission, in weighing each recommendation submitted by the Secretary of Defense, is required to explicitly state whether the Department significantly deviated from any of the 8 criteria and point out the criteria deviated before making a recommendation. I therefore propose that the language in Section 12 be tightened to more clearly define the role of criteria of the Commission in Commission deliberations. Finally, I would suggest again the importance of the accounting of the real savings to taxpayers generated by the entire process. For the 2005 BRAC, the Department utilized an accounting system that estimated savings by closure and realignments of nearly $48 billion over 20 years. According to the GAO, that saving estimate has now declined to less than $20 billion, primarily due to vastly underestimated implementation costs. I would highlight that our BRAC round was as much about transformation of our military force structure as it was about cost savings. I would urge that the GAO be required to track and report to the Congress periodically on civilian property realignment costs and savings. Finally, I note that Section 15 provides that implementation of the Commission's recommendations are to be undertaken pursuant to existing authorities available to GSA and the federal agencies. While the legislation mandates that all recommended actions be completed no later than the end of a 6-year period, the legislation leaves the ultimate action an open question. In order to ensure prompt implementation of the recommended actions and disposal of such properties in a manner that will generate the most revenue to the government, and in order to avoid fire sale disposals, the legislation should specifically enable the disposing authorities with the ability to enter into ground leases, sale leasebacks, or other arrangements pending ultimate implementation of the Commission's recommendation. As you know very well, the need for swift disposal of non-performing assets was recognized and well managed during the savings and loan crisis in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the establishment of the Resolution Trust Corporation, which I believe could be used as a possible model for this Commission to dispose of properties. Their sole purpose was to dispose of properties promptly at a maximum return to the taxpayer. It was a federal agency that had that only purpose to fulfill. And finally, with respect to Section 20, in order to avoid potential confusion with respect to leasing authorities that some federal agencies currently possess, I recommend that subsection A be modified so as to recognize those authorities as not being affected. And I might just add one point about overseas properties. Believe it or not, the VA owns a property in Paris. I recall when I was Deputy Secretary of Veterans Affairs during Bush 41, I was asked by the Congress to take ownership of a building, a magnificent, valuable building in the golden area of Paris, France. It was a building that the American Legion inherited after World War I called the Pershing Hall, named after General Pershing. The U.S. government finally took possession of the building after bailing out the American Legion, but it fell into a state of disrepair. Monies were being stolen, artifacts were being stolen, and no one seemed to know what to do with this building. So the Congress asked if the VA would take possession of it. We did. We closed it down. We cleaned it up. We leased it to a major hotel. It is now Pershing Hall Hotel. All the artifacts are intact. It will always bear the name Pershing Hall, and the VA is receiving income on a long-term lease for that property. So I think even overseas it can be done and done in the right way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Norton.